Hi, everybody, and welcome to December 2021. Yeah, 2021. Ha! Can't believe it's almost the end of the year. I am Tracy Stuckrath, and this is the Eating at a Meeting podcast live edition that I do every single Wednesday. I am founder of the show as well as Thrive Meetings and Events. And on this show, I talk to experts in all facets of food and beverage to understand how we can create safe and inclusive and sustainable food and beverage experiences at events and meetings, no matter where you are in the world. And my guest today, I think I stalked McKenzie on LinkedIn is where I found her. But McKenzie Phelan. Oh my gosh, I can't say that right. Phelan.
It's a tongue twister. You got it.
Phelan. McKenzie Phelan. Oh my gosh, that's horrible. I should have that memorized before I actually start the show. McKenzie Phelan and Meghan Shellenberg.
Yes.
They are the founders of Foodmuse, a food and beverage design agency that they created in 2018. And when they were both actually working at Airbnb, which I am a big user of and used to be a host, they designed and implemented Airbnb's global food program. And that's how I found McKenzie on LinkedIn, because I was looking for corporate food programs to talk about them. And so I want to talk about, because in the rest of the description here is that it was the gold standard of institutional dining, particularly when it came to sustainable sourcing, and then how you could help food programs and other organizations design similar ethos. So McKenzie and Meghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you. I mean, we've chatted before, and I love what you all are doing. But talk about what actually is a global food program.
Sure. Great. Meg, do you want to take this one?
Sure.
In fact, Tracy found me on LinkedIn, but at the time, Meghan was actually my boss. So
okay.
It's one of our funny little jokes, boss turned co-founder turned bridesmaid once upon a time. But I think as my superior at that time, maybe Meghan can feel it.
It is a joke because very easily McKenzie could have been my boss. The two of us worked in tandem. So a global food program at Airbnb, we had about 40 offices globally. Our headquarters were in San Francisco, and far and large, the biggest offices, but we served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to each of our employees. And a global food program is sort of different and harder to establish because, say, in San Francisco, we had 3,000 employees. We had 250 food team employees only. Everything was made from scratch. And, we had huge, robust kitchens. We had, the best of procurement in the Bay Area. And then, we had the challenge of trying to replicate a program like that in like Beijing or in Dublin or in India in various locations. So the global food program really was just program designed by Airbnb to feed the Airbnb employees. So often we get sometimes confused with, how are you feeding all these people who are staying in Airbnbs? And it was a corporate food program, not part of the product.
Well, and we talked about this when we first chatted a couple of weeks ago, is that looking at it, sourcing from San Francisco, and like you just said, sourcing in wherever else you are in the world, you've got to find those local farmers, those local producers to source those specific, regions. But also we talked about managing the dietary needs of people in those offices as well, too. Mm-hmm. How did you manage how do you do that?
I'll take this one. So as Meghan mentioned, we developed sort of the ethos of the Airbnb food program at our headquarters in San Francisco. And, I think we would have been foolish at the onset to think like it was going to be super easy to replicate. In some cases, we found other offices had even more success. They were able to find, say, Portland, Oregon. They were right there in sort of like the heartbed of great agriculture. Dublin actually similarly was able to do some really impressive procurement. When it comes to other offices like Beijing, we were really had to like stress test our standards, because while we had like really rigorous sort of meat protocol, for example, we wanted it to be, completely free of any hormones, to be grass fed, all of that. And we also wanted it to come from within about 100-mile radius. That is really, really challenging in Beijing. There is not a ton of hormone-free grass-fed beef within 100 miles of Beijing. So it meant that we had to kind of start to create a ranking of like, what's the hierarchy of importance? And to answer your other question, like, where do dietary needs fit into that? What, for example, does it look like to have a meatless program that WeWork famously piloted? We can later on, if you'd like, sort of discuss our attempts at instituting a meatless day, and the sort of trials, tribulations, minor successes that came along with that. But I think specifically when it comes to addressing dietary standards, we had to realize that, the program was not a monolith, neither was an office. And we had to really think about ways to create something that felt true to a program we were designing, but with infinite customization. And we can talk about what that looked like sort of specifically. How do you set up a restaurant or a buffet, or, just like a line of sorts to address specific needs of different eaters, so as to not, alienate or other.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think sort of the core of how we addressed that was build your own options. So we would always have, an option for vegetarians, an option that was dairy-free, an option that was gluten-free. And, if you're one of the lucky few who can eat everything, you can eat everything. But if you can't have dairy, you can still have 4 of the items, and so on.
Well, and that I think has to become part of your ethos as well. Is like, how do you do this, and what does that mean? So let's jump into what Foodmuse does and how you do that, because I was scouring your website, which I told you earlier, and looking at the clients that you work with, and trying to really find and help them to define their values around food. And I think this can really be applied to thinking at events as well. But I want to jump into what that does and how you work with clients.
Awesome. We have like kind of a bifurcation of clients. We have what we started Foodmuse to address, which was we saw this opportunity in the marketplace, specifically in Silicon Valley, where there were a lot of smaller companies that wanted to recruit competitively, and having an on-site food program is, at this stage of the game in Silicon Valley, kind of like table stakes. So we wanted to try to help folks not immediately turn to like DoorDash or one of those entities that, is not really thoughtful about sort of like a holistic dietary landscape for an office place, or not particularly devoted to a certain sort of sourcing standard. So we have a group of clients that we still work with that are workplaces, places that we want to influence and impact their institutional dining. And then we have all kinds of other clients that we feel really privileged to work with, insofar as we're not coming with the same pedigree. Meghan and I know workplace dining like the back of our hand, but we have other clients in the nonprofit space or fellow creative agencies, and then, some just sort of for-profit food companies that we get to work with to sort of help them position themselves in the market and speak to their sort of food values. Of course, if you're a creative agency based in Italy, your food values are expressed through your medium, in their case, videography and photography. If you're a nonprofit in, the California heartland, then your food values are expressed through sort of like how workers in your cohort are treated, animal husbandry, all of that. So we try to like really tailor sort of these mission, vision, values, and propositions to our individual clients so that they can really speak and appeal to their respective audiences, sometimes for the purpose of, gaining notoriety, raising money, or just having, really deeply felt impact.
So just to jump in there real quick, I mean, so looking at, and I was working with an organization the other day looking at their mission and values, but it's even broader because the food is part of that, especially if you're serving food in your workplace or at meetings and events that you host, right? Not necessarily in there, but that has to come as part of what that means, doesn't it?
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What's interesting in workplace food programs versus our other clients is that in workplace food programs, we're entering a company that has an established set of values for their company. And so we're trying to insert ourselves into that as far as like, a food program really needs buy-in from everyone all the way to the top in order to be successful. And so we want to look at those values of the company, and then we want to tie into those for the food program. So a couple of examples from Airbnb. One of the values was be a host and sort of create a sense of belonging. And so it was really important that our food reflect that. It was important that our food team were all hosts of the space. It was important that we expected that of employees too. We expected them to be good hosts when they had guests or just cleaning up after themselves,
right?
themselves being a host.
Yeah.
And then, another value at Airbnb was to be a serial entrepreneur, which sort of has a backstory, but is really just about pushing forward and trying new things and not being afraid to fail. And we certainly did that, and we're allowed that leniency because that was a company value. And so when we can sort of reflect that and tie into company values, I think is when we can be most successful.
I can share one other one that makes me, that like working as an employee of Airbnb, we really those were part of our onboarding. Any employee could rattle off those 4 values, and they were deeply understood. It's been really interesting to be, not an FTE at these companies now with our clients who we work with. For example, DocuSign is one of them. I couldn't tell you what their values are. I don't know that. It's not just sort of part of the sort of cultural consciousness. But interestingly, they told us, that one of the things that they're most proud of, a pillar of their company, is sustainability. At first, I didn't totally understand how that was the case, but as an entity that has taken, tons and tons of paper and signing and massive contracts, all digital, they see sustainability as a huge, pillar of their proposition, of their value. And so we saw that as like, oh, this is kind of a backdoor into talking about all these other versions of sustainability that we want to champion and connect the dots in a way. For a place like Airbnb, those were sort of pre-connected for us, but seeing opportunities with our new clients, that's an interesting way to approach it.
That is a really interesting way, because people don't think about the sustainability of food and beverage really when they're eating it, whether it's at home or it's, at work or at an event. And I mean, I went to the World Expo in Milan in whatever year that was. And I went because it was all about food. It was a 2-day road trip just to go for 5 hours. And, which yeah, whatever. That's a long story, but the first exhibition when you walk in was all about food waste. And I mean, it was it was the size of a football field, right? And just talking about how much food is wasted. And that is one humongous thing about sustainability that, an organization like DocuSign I would think would be interested in if they have a company cafeteria, how is that wasted, reutilized, or as we were talking earlier before the show, what's that word that we were using? Not regentrifying, but
regenerative eating.
Regenerative eating, right? Yeah, and just regenerative agriculture, right? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I think that for all the past decade, we've been using the word sustainable over and over and over to the point of diluting kind of what we understand it to mean. It's definitely a word that's a victim of greenwashing. And I think that in an effort to be more specific, the sort of common parlance these days of what we're working towards in food systems reform is, highlighting regenerative agriculture. And so that just means factoring in, obviously, a myriad of inputs that are human and non-human. It's thinking about the soil, it's thinking about pest management, it's thinking about animals, it's thinking about farm workers, sort of all along the supply chain. And I use the word regenerative eating, which I think is maybe going to catch on. I sort of made it up, to be honest. But what I want that to sort of symbolize is a diet or an attitude towards food that prioritizes regenerative agriculture. And that, I think, can be reflected in workplaces. I think it can be reflected in large conferences, in meetings. I was shocked to hear from you, Tracy. You told us that food costs are the single highest spend, the highest line item for these large gatherings. Something that actually really surprised me, given how many conferences I've been to and how few great meals I've had. And, certainly meals that, some have been good, but do I know the provenance of the food? Are we bringing that into a discussion? I think that's a huge opportunity, especially for, the events that Meghan and I used to attend all the time, focusing on food. It always sort of was a head scratcher how the actual meals there seemed to be such an afterthought. You also shared that they don't really even get finalized till about a month out. And sometimes it shows.
Less.
I think there's a huge, the event planner in me from yesteryear, quivers at the thought. How terrifying, even less than a month. That's all to say, I think there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah. Go ahead, Meghan.
Food is always such an opportunity to tell a story. And you just think of, if you're not booking until the month before, what story are you telling? That you ran out of time, and you're just going to have to get whatever the caterer had left over that month or whatever. And so, looking through that lens, you can really think about whatever conference you're doing, whatever meeting you're doing, what is the story that you want to tell with food? And hopefully, we're hopeful that there's a lot more recognition around sustainability and around regenerative, and that there are opportunities with these huge budgets to be able to incorporate that more.
Well, and I think it also, just kind of going back with what your ethos are too, is we value you as an attendee. We value you as an association member because we're going to feed you well. So just like you're doing it and in a workplace and providing, and I'm assuming that breakfast, lunch, and dinner were free. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, and you can say it's free when I pay my registration, I'm paying you for food and beverage. Yeah. I don't know how much of my money is actually going to that food and beverage, but it's probably a large percent. But let's talk about regenerative agriculture a little bit too, and what that means with eating, because there's also an article that somebody posted the other day in a group that says, and this goes back to the cost of this, is that Cisco says it passed along a 13.4% cost spike to customers with little pushback. And so the cost of food and beverage is going up for a variety of reasons: lack of drivers, lack of, because of COVID, right? How can we use that regenerative agriculture and looking and sourcing that you did to help potentially bring those costs down, or make the food better at the same time? Is there a way to do that?
It's an amazing question. I think interesting, the sort of Cisco example means that 13% was probably the kickbacks that they were already given maybe went away. I think these broadliners often achieve their success through, getting large accounts and saying, if we get all of the universities in your system, we'll cut off 10%. And it's a really, really attractive route to go when, say, you work at Airbnb and you have 40 offices, and that kickback would be quite meaningful. I think it takes a really serious commitment to sourcing differently. And that's not to say that Cisco can't and won't. I have a lot of confidence that most large entities are going to have to find ways through hopefully more than just carbon offsets to be more sustainable. I think one of the things that's also interesting is just the cost of food being something that's so obfuscated, you don't you're not considering it as a thing that you're paying for, but in reality, you're probably not paying enough for it when you go to a conference. Like, you're not really paying for it as an eater at a workplace, but your workplace probably should pay more for it. You know, your sweet green salad should also probably cost more. I think we're talking about huge food systems reform at that point, you know, trying to redirect subsidy money. But I think that that's what, like, if I had my druthers, that's what we'd all be focusing on, is how do we actually get a little bit more investment towards regenerative agriculture so that those costs can go down, become more accessible, be brought on by, say, a Cisco because they finally have the volume to supply it. And, you know, that way more meeting directors, food program managers can access that. I love, Meghan actually did this, and it's something that I like to brag about as a thing that Airbnb did, but Meghan functionally did it, which was this sort of program around buying futures that I think would be really cool for her to tell everyone about.
All right. Yeah. Tell me what that means.
Yeah. So when I first started at Airbnb 8 or so years ago, I came on as the buyer. I was doing all of the purchasing of the local products. And it was such a dream job because I just got to work with farmers, ranchers, fishermen, and, you know, we cut out Cisco. We weren't using Cisco. So we were going direct for everything. And so, yeah, we instated a few different programs. Futures is one where, you know, at the start of the year or the start of the quarter, we would assign a specific amount of money. And this took a lot of wrangling with our finance team. So I will say there was a lot of money up front, or there was a lot of work up front to get the money. But say we would assign $100,000 to one producer. And then over the course of the quarter or the course of the year, however it was set up, we would just draw down from that balance. But giving somebody $100,000 in January is so different than most tech companies who are 60 days late on paying any of their invoices, and the farmer has to do all the upfront costs. You know, so it provided them with this money up front that
capital,
they invest into it. Yeah. And I also really enjoyed crop planning. So I would sit down with farmers. I would take a look at what we did the previous year. I would take a look at headcount projections, how the growth of our employee base for the next year. And I would say, listen, I'm going to need 1,000 pounds of onions next year. Can you plant those for us for the following year? You know, we'll need that, you know, a year from now or 6 months from now or something like that. And so to be able to work with farmers in that way was just so reassuring for them.
Amazing.
Yeah. And yeah, I have this one farmer who I just adore in Winters. His farm is called Free Spirit Farms. And when we first started working with him, he had about 1 acre or 2 acres. And over the course of our time with him, he's acquired about 40 acres. And it's because he had a client like Airbnb and other tech clients who were able to just be so responsible with him as a client, and to be able to say, you know, you have our business, you can grow, you know, as many onions as you can grow, we'll buy, basically. And so he was really able to grow his business that way. And so I loved doing that work. And, you know, there's a point at which that becomes a little bit unsustainable, or it becomes, you know, 4 people's jobs instead of 1 person's job, because you need to manage so many. But I think to McKenzie's point earlier, what was so successful in our other locations at Airbnb, in our Portland office and our Dublin office, was the population was smaller. So there were about 500 people we were feeding. And so they just had a million of those kinds of success story relationships, where in San Francisco, we had to get a little bit bigger. We had to bring in some more people, but we never went Cisco. We went the route of aggregators.
Okay.
And I think that's something super important to call out too, when you're talking about sustainability and wanting to source the right way, is that, you know, I can't have 100 farmers that grow 40 pounds of onions each. And so, you know, to get around that, but to still be able to support those farmers, we were using a lot of aggregators. So KP Valley Farm Shop, Sonoma Feed, and those hubs are so important, I think, to the future of our food, because that is one hub They are talking to all of the ranchers, all
Right.
of the fishermen, all of the farmers in their areas. And then we're ordering through one portal. And probably most importantly, we're getting one delivery, which is also transportation is such an issue. And
That story reminds me of More Farms and Friends they're in Alabama, and they actually get food from North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Alabama, and they deliver it to Atlanta in CSA boxes once a week and at the farmers market. And so they're kind of that aggregator, and they actually do kind of a futures program saying, hey, buy into us up front for the year, and then pay down what you've put in, throughout the whole year. And I love that as a farmer co-op kind of thing option, because you also got to pick what you wanted in your box at the same time, so I think I like that program, and would hope that institutional dining, the hotels, convention centers could do that to help their local communities and their farmers. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me. And I know you've got Las Vegas convention center size hotels versus, Annapolis, Maryland. That's going to be completely different, like your offices, right? Completely different sizes and where you're going to get your food from and how you're going to do that. But I think that's definitely a way that we could potentially think about it. Have you had difficulty promoting the value of regenerative eating in the large institutions? I mean, and what has been the major resistance? Because I can come up with a whole bunch of ideas that meeting planners would tell you. So, and or these catering partners. So what are your biggest challenges that you've seen?
In a word, yes, we have had trouble. I think, not to be a broken record, it's a cost consideration, I think, at its core, whether it's, immediate investment in the dollars that can sometimes be an inhibiting factor, or in someone's time, to just go the extra mile to find this food, source it individually, that can be really challenging. And then I think there's something to be said for, if you're a convention center, you're also feeding a transient population. This isn't, it isn't a workplace where you can try to sort of quantify the ROI on that investment, because people report to being, more productive, or they feel more loyalty to their company. They want to stay, they're enjoying the culture, that this food program fosters. Instead, this is a transient group that are there for an occasion and then they leave. So that ROI is a little bit harder to quantify. I think that what the solution might be is exactly what Meghan said earlier. It's having your medium be the message. If you're there to talk about sustainability, if you're there to talk about climate change, regenerative agriculture, the future, capital F, then having your food tell the same story, I think it's the only way to not create a dissonance and a, sort of disingenuousness. So I think that's part of how you succeed. For us at Airbnb, the whole company mission was to foster belonging. And we thought that food, both, by virtue of it being sustainable, fostered belonging, but also I think the way that we created menus, the sorts of foods, the sorts of cuisines, the sorts of ingredients we used, we also wanted to, foster belonging and create an inclusive eating environment. So it's kind of two sides of the same.
It's amazing, and it's I want the whole world to be this way. But so Meghan, finding the chefs and the sous chefs and the line cooks and the servers that believed in those ethos, I mean, and wanted to do that cooking, and because you get a lot of, I've had chefs yeah, no, this is what I do, and this is how I do it, and I don't want any part of this. Was that a challenge in and of itself, or was that easier than you would think?
I've never had that experience. Maybe I'm very lucky with chefs who are, for lack of a better word, lazy or not wanting to do it. We always had such inspired chefs who were coming from crazy backgrounds. Like we had people coming from Michelin star restaurants because there was a lot of safety in working, and we worked a Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 sort of deal. And so chefs, a lot of our chefs came to Airbnb to start families, honestly. And so the chefs were super inspired, and I think that lends a lot to how Airbnb was set up with global menus and being able to try all kinds of different things. We had a beverage department where we made all of our beverages in-house, and so people were really inspired by that. We had a sort of a zero waste goal, and so chefs were always being challenged with, like, what do you do with all the bacon fat? What do you do with the ends of all the 40 pounds of an end of celery? What can you do with that? And so no, we never, and we paid well, and so we never really had much trouble with chefs being excited about it. That wasn't ever an issue.
Well, and that's really exciting because you also get chefs that this is the way they were trained and thinking outside of the box, and how do you do this, and using fresher ingredients probably takes a little bit more of a twist in how you do things. I would hope for the better, right? Well, I would, definitely think for the better. But yeah, it depends on where they were trained, and if they were trained with 100% French cuisine, like this is how you do all these things. And even Steven Satterfield, and I don't know if you all know him, he's in Atlanta and he owns a restaurant called Miller Union, and he's a friend of mine, but he was talking about in culinary school, when you cut the carrot and you have to dice it, it had to be perfectly diced. And then they threw all the scraps in the trash.
Yeah.
And now he's completely, and he doesn't use Cisco. I mean, he completely goes directly to the farmer, but it's like, how do you use those scraps and and like the celery heads that you had just mentioned,
Yeah, something that we were so lucky to have, and we sort of worked into our all of our contracts, was that we did an offsite twice a year with the team. And so we would take our 200 chefs, 200, our whole kitchen staff to a farm. And for dishwashers or people who were newer to the industry, for a lot of them, it was the first farm they had ever been to. And we would do a farm tour and talk about the product. And that was the exact product that they were using every day. And so it, broke the barrier of, like, food arrives, we cook it, it goes, this is the farmer. We've created a relationship. These are his kids. These are, his grandkids or whatever. This is the land. This is the carrot coming out of the ground. And that, I think, was huge for a lot of people, myself included. I loved those.
Yes,
totally.
Yeah. And going forward, I mean, do you think, I want to say this is the wave of the future, but there's not a lot of companies out there or organizations that have the money that Airbnb had to put into this. So how does somebody that doesn't have those resources start this process?
Yeah.
Airbnb doesn't even do it anymore. Just,
COVID is everything.
Totally. It's such a smart question and such a tough question. Meghan, if you have a specific answer, I have kind of a general musing about food and beverage industry writ large, but we can start with kind of workplace,
Yeah, I was when I was sourcing, when I was doing the buying, I was part of a group called the Bay Area Sustainable Sourcing Group. And it was institutional buyers coming together. It was Cal Berkeley, it was Stanford, it was other tech companies coming together to say, if we all change our standards and we say we are only going to buy this type of meat, people will have to raise, they will have to raise their standards to that. Mm-hmm. And so I think, for Airbnb, we were sort of just easily able to say that. For someone like Berkeley or, anyone else, you could start with 20% this year and look to grow to 30%. And as those products, as the standards grow higher, the price comes down, and they're better able to incorporate that into their programs.
Okay.
And I think something specific to universities and what we've been hearing is that students care, and students are smart. I think about my time at school and the cafeteria food. And, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But these days want to know, they're not going to eat it, and so I think that there is a general awakening, and same with employees and people who are eating really smart. They want to know where things come from, and so I think if you can make shifts, however, start where you are and make a shift, where you can. The 20%, 30% spending is the place to start, I think.
I think it's also gonna, like most things, like supply and demand. I think as the demand increases for it, we're going to see people needing to prioritize it. I think what we were trying to do in roles like ours was influence demand, but I feel really heartened when I see things popping up on menus. Like there was the era where it was like, here's how many calories this is in this dish. Now there's like a sort of greenhouse gas emissions number starting to pop up on menus, and people talking about the carbon footprint of what they're eating. I booked a flight the other day and saw that there was sort of a greenhouse gas emissions number associated with my flight. And I think that as we start to have consumers prioritize it, then just like all marketplaces, there's going to need to be a reaction. So I'm feeling optimistic, I think.
Well, okay, because you're both in California. So I met a woman a couple of months ago, and she's like, yeah, they took foie gras away from us in California, and now they're taking pork away from us, and what are we coming to? And I was like, what do you mean? And I Googled it, and it's because
who's they?
I know. California government, but they're actually making standards, like you said, Meghan, and requiring that only pork that's been raised humanely in this fashion can be utilized in the state of California. Wow. And there's only 4 pig farmers or 4 facilities in the country that actually allow that or do that right now.
Yeah, but I bet in 5 years there's going to be 40,
Right. Because also California is like the #1 pork eaters in the country.
Yeah, that's interesting that she said that, because to me, being someone who's really conscious about food, why would you want to eat pork that wasn't that way? Why would you even want that choice? But I understand, people don't want government infringement. That's a whole different story. But
I think, Meg, I mean, you talk about it, but like we had a debacle with meat. I think that people have a really sensitive reaction to like having their diets, quote unquote, policed, to borrow vernacular that was leveled at us. People feel a really strong attachment to their diet.
It's very personal.
Very personal.
So personal.
Yeah. So, I mean, all right. There's one. So we were also talking just before we got on the show about your client kitchen table advisors. And I loved and I will, if you don't mind, I'll share that link to them. But the graphic that you did, you mapped market access. I just pulled it up for the farmer and buyer opportunities. And this seems overwhelming, and I'm sure it is, when you look at it and how you do it, and what a meeting planner or a convention center, hotel, or an institution, how they source their food from. I mean, it's looking at all of those aspects: distributors, CPG, restaurants, retail, e-commerce, food service. I mean, that's changing a lot, and which really brings to mind my friend Emily Brown, who's in Kansas City, and she started the Food Equality Initiative. And because her daughters had food allergies, and she was on WIC, and WIC would not allow her to buy gluten-free breads because it only said whole wheat bread in the government write-ups, right? So she's working to change that and bring access to food allergic families. But it's like looking at all of this and making these standards and making these ethos that we want. It's really trying to change the entire food system. Am I crazy?
Yeah. No, you're spot on. Yeah.
And how do the three of us just do that and help all these people do that?
If we knew, the food system would be totally changed.
Yeah.
I mean, shout out to Kitchen Table Advisors and specifically Heather Frombach, who conducted that research. Meghan and I contributed to sort of the like data visualization, and I'd like to think that we were, partners in getting that thing over the line. I do think it's worth a look. I mean, if people are interested in seeing how their individual, contributions to, or their, food decisions contribute to the food system, it's kind of an interesting thing to take a look at. I also think, that, well, not to quote Michael Pollan, but like we do make these choices with all of our food dollars, 3 times a day you're voting with your food dollars. So I think just considering it and, trying to look at the bigger picture, not just what sort of civil liberties you might think are being infringed upon when the, naughty pork goes away. I think trying to just really take into account the whole system, as hard as that is, and like systems reform is just so hairy. We don't pretend to have the end all be all answers. I just think that like conscious consumption is really what we advocate. And I think that's a really good place to start for those who don't really know where to begin. It's just being a little bit more conscious about your sourcing, your procurement, all that.
Well said. Yeah, you just have to start where you are. There's room for improvement always. But just little by little, if your friend can get that gluten-free passed, how much good that would do for so many people.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So and I know one of your answers is going to be what I just put up there, was 1 or 2 resources that you'd be willing to share with listeners on how to move this forward. And so I shared the link on your site for Kitchen Table Advisors. But any other suggestions besides you?
Give us a call. No shameless plugs. I think that RegenOne is probably a really cool resource that is already, people are learning a lot about it. Meghan contributed to the project from sort of an early level. Do you want to talk about RegenOne, Meg?
Yeah, RegenOne is sort of this gigantic project that started in Northern California, and it brought together experts in every aspect of food production. And so I was part of the marketplace team as far as I was, representing a purchasing entity, but it had farmers, it had graphic designers, it had transportation and logistics participants, and all coming together to crack this exact nut that you're talking about, Tracy, and saying like, surely, in the heart of Silicon Valley, if we can get all of these people together, we can move the needle. And sort of what came of it, I mean, so many amazing things came of it, and I highly suggest checking out the website, and so much work is continuing to be done. But what came from sort of my perspective is that there was a pledge for companies like Airbnb or other tech companies or universities or institutional buyers to pledge that they would start with 1%, with buying 1% regenerative agriculture, and look to increase that over the next 10 years. And so I just think it's a wonderful resource to take a look at, and a blueprint. The whole idea was for it to always be open source. And so we're hoping that, people in every other region across the country, across the globe, can use this as a resource for how to move the needle in their local food system.
Well, all right. So I do want to ask you to define the word because we've been talking about it through this entire show, but let's define it for everybody else.
Yeah, regenerative agriculture is not depleting the soil, really. And I think there are a million other aspects of it, but at the core of it, big farmers pesticides, all of that depletes the soil. And so when you're looking to have a regenerative agriculture, you maybe have 3 fields and you're growing on 2 a year, and then you move to the next 2 to let that field rest. There are lots of different methods. That's just one. But how do you keep the soil healthy? And soil health is, really the backbone of everything to continue thriving on this globe. And so if we can keep the soil healthy, then we can continue to have, wonderful produce, wonderful items for years to come. When you deplete the soil with things like pesticides or Roundup or any of those things, you then rely on pesticides and Roundup every year to be able to grow your crop, because, they produce the fertilizer and the killer. And so you have to have both to be able to grow your crops. That's my definition. Ken's, do you have?
Oh, the only thing I would add, I think you nailed it. So smart. Is just also just biodiversity. Like, you want different crops on that soil so that the root depths are different, so that they're pulling water at different rates, so that they themselves are decomposing and putting sort of diverse micronutrients back into the soil. It's, to echo Meghan, the soil is everything. It affects the watershed, all of that. And so I think it's just trying to avoid monocultures for the reasons Meghan outlined, but then also because if there's just the one, the roots are only getting so far. You're only promoting a certain sort of local diet option. I think the idea would be to have more biodiversity in more places so that we don't have, the corn belt, and then we have the soybean belt. Having smaller biodiverse farms to sustain local populations would be sort of the hallmark of great regenerative food system.
That is amazing and awesome, and what we really need to do. And there was a social media post the other day. It was talking about just people's yards and how short
Totally.
the roots are to that. And when we do it, we actually need to create bigger roots and let them grow and all of that. And when I went to Slow Food Terra Madre Salon de Gusto, there was the soil campaign was huge. And it's really a big, humongous thing that we all need to focus on. That sounds very little 5-year-oldish, big, humongous thing we all need to focus on, but it is.
No, it's so right. I mean, yeah. It is humongous.
It is humongous. And I know that there's farmers out there, White Oak Pastures in South Georgia is working on that as well. And with their animal, rotating their animals and stuff, it's not just crops as well. So yeah. Well, oh my gosh, we've been talking for 47 minutes and I love that. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. What is your favorite, to wrap this up, what are your favorite food and drinks? And actually, I know you've got your favorites, and Meghan, I'm really excited for you to share this about it. But what about also coming into the holidays? Do you have a favorite dish that you want coming into the holidays?
That's a great question. Favorite dish coming into the holidays, I think, are au gratin potatoes. Are a family staple in my family. My Aunt Sherry started it, and now we make them every year. And I'm very excited and proud of myself, patting myself on the back, because for Thanksgiving our oven is out, but I made them on the stovetop, and so we still have them.
Nice.
That's my favorite holiday tradition. Ken?
Oh boy. Oh man, my sincere answer is popcorn balls, but that just sort of betrays everything I just espoused on this whole podcast, because it's popcorn and Crisco or Caro syrup or something. But my grandfather makes them, and I just, they're a kryptonite. But as the antidote, I would say, I'm going to New York tonight, and I'm really excited to have local hot apple cider from there. That I would be really excited to have. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you both, McKenzie Phelan and Meghan Shellenberg from Foodmuse. I really appreciate it. And one thing I was thinking is like listening to the two of you talk, and you started a global food program at Airbnb, but you're so ingrained into, which is a good word, into soil and how farmers work. And you would never have thought that I think probably a lot of people would think that you're in charge of the food at this office building. Why do you need to know about the lengths of roots and what farmers do and all of that stuff? So very, very impressive. So thank you very much for the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
You're welcome. And I look forward to collaborating with the both of you on more things, because there's lots of things that we can do together.
Likewise.
Yeah. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. This is December 1st, 2021. End of the year is almost here. We are here live every single Wednesday talking to experts like Meghan and McKenzie about how to create safe, inclusive, and sustainable food and beverage experiences for everyone. So until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks.